Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. The House of Love and Death is the latest installment of the Cameron Winter novels. If you're not familiar with the series, it revolves around the titular Cameron Winter, a man who retired from a top-secret government wet work organization to become an English professor. Yes, really. While that setup may seem a little prosaic, I assure you this series is deeply fascinating. Andrew Klavan is a respected crime author. He's written the novels True Crime and Empire of Lies, just to name a few. While I am not familiar with either of those novels, I have read Werewolf Cop, also by Andrew Klavan, and his Another Kingdom trilogy, as well as the previous two books in the Cameron Winter series. I initially became interested in Klavan's work after reading his memoir, The Great Good Thing. While I found his recounting of his life story and the things that brought him about to a conversion to Christ very fascinating, I can't say any of his work really gelled with me up until this point. Werewolf Cop is a fascinating book about a detective who is bitten by a werewolf, as you might guess. As someone who knew very little about Klavan's work outside of his satirical monologues up until that point, Werewolf Cop was not exactly what I was expecting. It was a deep, gritty investigation of the conflict between our wild inner natures and our penchant for savagery, and mankind's need to create a healthy environment to grow and live in. There was also a murder in there somewhere, which was important to the plot, but I struggled to remember any of the details because that really wasn't what struck me as important about the story. It felt very much to me like Andrew Klavan was trying to take a point he had about human nature and where it is in modern society and make it through the format of a mystery novel. That's very understandable and honestly quite common in writing today. Unfortunately, being a very common narrative technique, that means we don't usually see it done very well, because most of what we see in any medium is not done very well. I'd like to say Werewolf Cop is an exception, but it's really not. Klavan's specialty is writing thrillers, and I have to admit I was very gripped reading that book, but again, as I've already said, not a whole lot of it stuck with me. Another Kingdom is a fantasy trilogy, also written as thrillers, with a lot of really great and imaginative ideas in it. While I sometimes found the ideas a little on the nose in the way they worked out in the story, there were some fantastic bits of imagery in there. The Nightmare Feast, where a creature hunts down and devours people trapped in a house every night, and then they are revived to experience the same horror again, was a fascinating insight into some of the cultural loops we're stuck in. Austen Lively's trip through the underworld is a horrifying and gripping recounting of what it may be like to pay a visit to hell. And the metaphors we see in there of the larger ideas that the everyday person can find themselves entrapped by, the struggle for virtue in a very corrupt and pagan world, these were all very strong. Likewise, Austen's situation is very gripping and well-paced. It brings us in touch with some of the seedier parts of the mundane reality we all inhabit. But much like the abrupt transition between these two worlds, the fantasy of high ideals and the reality of the everyday nitty-gritty, I felt like some of Austen's revelations and some of his transitions in his life were equally abrupt. The first Cameron Winter novel feels like it's going back to something a little simpler. It's a simple story about a man who has done a lot of things he doesn't look back on with a great deal of approval, who is now trying to, in some way, work out a redemption for himself in this small, sleepy college town he now resides in. Cameron has a strange habit of mind, where he puts himself in the situation of a crime, and his imagination allows him to understand all the people that were there, the decisions they were making, and what that means about the crime and who is guilty of it. It's a fascinating idea for a character, and Klavan uses his understanding of the pace and tempo and character dynamics of a thriller to turn When Christmas Comes into a very exciting exploration of a character's inner thoughts and how they kind of begin to play out in the outside world as he comes to grips with them. The second novel, A Strange Habit of Mind, expands on this theme, but I didn't feel like either of these books was working on quite the scale that Werewolf Cop or the Another Kingdom trilogy were. And then I read the introduction to the House of Love and Death. In that story, we see a house afire, 4 of the 5 residents have been shot. The firefighters who respond to the scene find nothing but corpses, already dead, as the flames move to claim them. Death has been at work in the house, and its shadow over the story is long and dark. But the hand of death is not the only hand that has been at work in this house. It is the house of love and death, after all. Now, death is something that Cameron knows very well, but love is something he's always struggled to understand. It is his struggle to balance these two things and get a better grasp on what it means to live in a house of love that forms the grand and eternal tapestry against which the more mundane story of these 4 murders plays out. The House of Love and Death is what convinced me that Klavan has finally managed to balance the small mundane stories that we all live in every day and these grand, eternal concepts that are struggling for our very souls. There are many layers to this conflict, and each is fascinating. We see a stark contrast, for example, between 2 women in Cameron's lives. Both very attractive in their own way, but each embodying a different approach to what it means to be a woman. One hostile to Cameron, but someone who still needs his help. The other very appealing to him, but ethically out of reach. We also see the contrast between the eternal ideas of the situation and the shallow, empty, hollow imitations of them. The climax of this book hinges on what it means to see the shape of something bereft of its substance and what it means to pursue that thing in fact. This constant tension between the deep and eternal truths of a situation and our limited, frail attempts to bring them into reality through our own actions tells me that Klavan has in fact mastered the thing he has been trying to do with his past half-dozen novels. It is beautiful, it is impactful, and it is thrilling. Congratulations, Mr. Klavan. I think you found the answer. There are lots of people who will tell you to support an artist because of their political beliefs. There are people who will tell you to support an artist because we need to change the industry. There are people who will tell you to support an artist because we need to build something new. There may be some truth to those claims. But here, we live by Arakawa's law. Applause must come in response to the art. It cannot be decided before you experience the art. I have read several of Klavan's novels that have a lot of promise to them. He can certainly write a thriller like no one else. But this is the book where he mastered the art of tying a thrilling moment to a glimpse of eternity. And that, my friends, is why I suggest you check out The House of Love and Death. I've included a link to it down in the description. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.